So it all started when this specific video uploaded by Shockpod just showed up in our recommended on YouTube. And it was just a short, simple 30-second video that compared the opening area from Cairo Station on easy difficulty versus legendary difficulty. And it's kind of just a punchline how quickly on legendary difficulty you get utterly destroyed. But this video did spark the idea for us to look at the rest of the Halo franchise and even Halo 2 more closely and look at some of the interesting differences that are used in difficulty across Halo games. Now, we've played Halo so many times across this channel, just doing random challenges or going for achievements, where some levels really stand out when you start to scale it up in difficulty. And we're not even talking Lasso yet, that's for another video. So we thought it'd be fun to take a look back at every Halo game and kind of compare easy difficulty to the legendary difficulty. Starting things off with good old Halo Combat Evolved. Since it seems like we practically live on Truth and Reconciliation anyways, we decided to load up TNR on easy difficulty and kind of take a look at the opening area where you typically jump in and snipe the Covenant. This whole outdoor section is a complete walk in the park. You can literally run past enemies, and the elites and whatnot are just one shot to kill them off. Compare that just to legendary difficulty. While of course experienced Halo players can clear their way through the Covenant in Halo Combat Evolved, some sections are definitely much more challenging and just the scale of all of the enemies is more intense. Instead of being able to run past the enemies, you do have to take out the enemies as you push forward unless you're a pro speedrunner. And some bigger enemies like the elites, for example, even without shields, can sometimes take 2 sniper shots to kill. Not as quick and easy like it is on easy difficulty. The library was another section we thought would be an interesting place to take a look at. And one thing we actually noticed was that when we were running through on easy difficulty, besides just navigating the early section, which is kind of a walk in the park if you keep moving, it seemed like the overall amount of enemies seemed to be lesser than that of legendary difficulty. Legendary difficulty seems just very unforgiving in throwing enemies at you constantly. Okay, and then with 2 betrayals, it's interesting if you just stand still at the beginning of the level and see how long you can last on easy difficulty versus how long you can last on legendary difficulty. 2 betrayals is definitely a good example where you can see the differences between easy and legendary difficulty. Things can get really hairy on legendary, but interestingly enough, later on in the level after you clear the 2 bridges, you get to this corridor where, yes, on legendary it is a little bit more challenging, but no matter what difficulty you're on, there's a pretty high guarantee that this flood dude is just gonna mess you up, even if you're playing on easy difficulty. Also, as we look at Combat Evolved, and as is in the case of a lot of these other Halo games, thanks to Halopedia for some valuable facts here, but player shields are half their normal resistance, so a few hits from a plasma weapon will often drain shields pretty fast. Also, enemy shields are typically stronger, and interestingly enough, in Combat Evolved, when it comes to grunts, typically twice as many grunts will show up than on the lower difficulties, and a lot of them are the upgraded class of Grunt Major. Also, as with the typical later on Halo games too, enemies just seem to have a much faster fire rate, which can completely wreck you. Okay, and then I don't know if it's just me, but it really seems like Halo 2 just has one of the craziest jumps ever when you're looking at the differences between easy and legendary. Outskirts is a great place to look at the very beginning. If you're on easy difficulty and you're running through those alleyways, you're really not going to run into too many problems. You have enough of a reaction time to fight back against the jackals, but on legendary, those jackals in the quote-unquote sniper alley are the Halo equivalent to someone playing Call of Duty with a JTAG'd Xbox 360 and having a sniper aimbot. Now, the one big thing that is cool about Halo 2 though is that technically by doing several different tricks, a lot of levels can kind of be curved a bit on its difficulty by doing interesting skips, like running across the rooftops on Outskirts or even on Delta Halo. You could practically avoid a large portion of the enemies you encounter just by doing some glitches outside of the map. But if you choose to face off against the enemies head on, it definitely is this upper echelon of difficulty as things just get very intense very quickly, and the speed and velocity that you can die in Halo 2 is definitely one of the highest ones challenges that's out there. For instance, we loaded up on Gravemind just to test it out and see what it's like between easy and legendary. Easy difficulty, we just stood there for a bit and it took over a minute before we actually were killed spawning in. And then when we tried it again on legendary difficulty, it literally took less than a second before one of us would get killed at the beginning of this level. Now spread instances like this across the entire Halo 2 campaign, and you can start to see what we're talking about when you really start to look at the game itself side by side, or you start to compare these difficulty scales. Also, Halo 2 was the first Halo game in the franchise to, when legendary difficulty was enabled, the enemies would also throw more grenades at players, something that continued on in later Halo games. Oh, and one of the pleasant joys when it comes to legendary difficulty is of course the fact that when you're playing co-op, your lives are linked together, so it's kind of like the Iron Skull is always on. Okay, then Halo 3 is actually a little bit of a fun one to look at, just because in general the legendary ceiling was lowered a little bit, and maybe it's just us, but we also felt like easy difficulty was maybe raised a little bit in difficulty as well. Not by much, but maybe just a tad. For instance, on Sierra 117, there is this little strip where there are a bunch of jackals up in the trees, and on easy difficulty, you can pretty much just walk your way through without having to worry about anything. Most of the jackals have carbines, but one or two have a beam rifle, and even then, the beam rifle oftentimes misses on its first shot. Legendary difficulty is a completely different story though, because as you run through, the jackals with the carbine are steady enough with their aim to just completely drain your shield and wreck you pretty quickly, and then let alone the beam rifle sniper that just pops up and kills you if you make it past those carbines. We did have a little bit of fun on the level of the Covenant, just pushing our way up on the beach, trying to clear out the Covenant in different ways on easy difficulty versus legendary. And easy difficulty, it's honestly a cakewalk. It makes sense why we do some of the challenges where we're trying to beat Halo without shooting on easy difficulty, because we're trying to see in the easiest way possible if something is possible or not. And when you jump into legendary, you can tell right away that the Covenant means business. But it's still cool that over the years, we've been able to experience a campaign that evolves in a really thorough and unique way, while also keeping something that's a core mechanic across all the Halo games, like these different difficulties. Even the end level of Halo 3 is quite different between easy and legendary. On easy, even the Flood just kind of falls apart like they're actually made of paper, where on legendary, you have to pace yourself out, as the speed of the Flood seems to be a big mechanic in the game. Some of the combat forms are really fast, and while you can kill them quickly, you have to watch out for the other Flood that's kind of lurking in the shadows just to drain your shield a little bit more. Playing through this level regularly without doing any big skips is a very different experience between the difficulties, rightfully so, and while a boss fight like Guilty Spark is nearly identical between the easy difficulty and the legendary difficulty, there's also a really interesting thing that happens on the Warthog run when you're on legendary difficulty, where the Sentinels are much more accurate with their beams, and it can mess up your driving ability and just straight up kill you if your gunner isn't shooting at the Sentinels correctly. This is kind of a feature that's non-existent in easy difficulty. Rarely do you have to worry about those Sentinels, but it is a very interesting way that they made this last level continuously challenging, even if you're on the higher difficulty. This could have easily been a level that was identical through and through between easy and legendary, but it's cool to see something like a Warthog run be treated differently just because of the way that the difficulty scaled and the enemy placement that made all of the difference. And in general, with Halo 3, besides enemy AI just being in general much smarter, there were some interesting additions added for a little bit of extra challenge here and there. Like for instance, the Sentinels on legendary difficulty all have shields, giving them even more health. And once again, the higher difficulty typically promotes the ranks of a lot of the enemies you encounter. Switching over to Halo 3 ODST, this one was actually a little bit interesting because this is a game that we sometimes just play for fun. Matter of fact, we're the 8th fastest co-op easy difficulty runners in the Halo Runs community. This is of course out of 8 entries, but hey, we enjoy running the game and trying to improve improve our time, even though we're nowhere as fast as the regular speedrunners. But there also was a time where we tried running ODST on Legendary with Dim and Tails, and we did notice right away that there are some pretty drastic differences in some places when you up the difficulty from easy to Legendary. Now, unfortunately, we never got too much further in our run because Tails fell asleep in the middle of the speedrun, so we called it quits at Kazingo Boulevard. But Teari Plaza was definitely a really interesting experience to look at easy versus Legendary, especially in the last area. On easy difficulty, you can literally just run past all of the enemies and not have to worry about anything. Even the hunters that run through, you can just sidestep them and just keep going straight to Dare's pod. But on Legendary difficulty, it's actually quite a bit harder. The Jackal snipers are everywhere and they can just pick you off one by one by one by one, and then those hunters aren't anything to mess around with either, because one shot or a smack will just completely kill you right there, and they're just much faster than the other enemies, plus all the other enemies shooting at you are just way more accurate on Legendary difficulty. Another section that is quite different is in Kazingo Boulevard, where when you're on easy difficulty, you literally kind of don't have too much to worry about, just pop off some wraiths, you can just board them like it's nothing, and maybe there's a ghost driving around. And on Legendary, it just seems like the concentration of enemies is so much higher, and there's so much chaos going on in this level when you're on Legendary. And then Coastal Highway is another level that's very interesting. On easy difficulty, you pretty much don't have to do anything except just kind of drive around and mess around, and Dare's dump truck Oliphant will be fine, especially if you have Buck in the back of your Warthog. You'll shoot at anything, but even then, I don't think I've ever had an encounter on easy difficulty where the enemies were able to kill the Oliphant. Legendary is a completely different story because you actually have to worry about protecting the Oliphant at all times, and it is definitely much more challenging because there's some parts that can just completely wreck that Oliphant very quickly. Halo Reach is another great one. As a matter of fact, Halo Reach was the first Halo game that I sat down and solo played Legendary. All my other Legendary runs beforehand were as co-op as a younger gamer, and I vividly remember Tip of the Spear. Easy difficulty, no big deal. You can just kind of run up, jump in the Warthog, go for a little ride, all's good. You can even just run this level on foot, no problem. Legendary difficulty, that shade turret right there with the fuel rod gun is just so unbelievably angry at all times. It doesn't matter which way you run, it doesn't matter what you try to use for cover, whoever's on that shade turret just has this hyper focus on ending your life, and it's pretty crazy. While we were also looking at Halo Reach, we thought it could be kind of fun to run along Long Night, and this opening beach section we thought would be a great place to test some things out. It is really interesting how chaotic things are in both easy and Legendary difficulty, but when you're just running through on easy difficulty, it might look very chaotic. Drop pods are coming in, elites are popping up, Grunts and Jackals are all over the place, but you're never really just like low on health or just draining out of health very quickly. Where on Legendary difficulty, if you literally peek your head out of cover at the wrong time, you'll just get completely destroyed. Now, we did get lucky a few times with some types of runs where we made it slightly further than other times, but at the end of the day, the enemies are just very aggressive and can kill you really quickly, so it's kind of funny looking at the differences here. We also thought it'd be interesting if we loaded up Lone Wolf and just kind of stood there just to see the differences and how long we can survive on easy difficulty, and then how long we survived on Legendary difficulty. Sure, it does take a few moments before the enemies actually start to drop in, but of course, with Reach, you can just tell that your health and how much you can resist against the enemies significantly less than in obvious easy difficulty. I guess the ongoing trend that we should have expected from this topic is that easy difficulty is a little bit easy and Legendary difficulty it's a little bit hard. Still, it's kind of fun to just compare and see how some of these levels play out. For instance, this time when we look at Halo 4, things felt very different than what we noticed with the Bungie era of Halo games, specifically if we're looking at the Forerunner enemies themselves. From our experience, when we played through Infinity, for example, on easy difficulty, it was more or less a basic walk in the park. The Promethean Knights still take quite a bit to kill, but nothing that an experienced Halo player can't overcome. But then when you go back and you played on Legendary difficulty, you notice this similar dynamic to easy difficulty. We actually noticed that the Promethean Knights, while they are obviously bulkier on Legendary difficulty, still serve as the main hardest part of the difficulty increase. but other enemies like crawlers, for example, or even watchers don't actually seem that much harder on legendary. It almost seems like the higher upper class enemies are the real change, and the lower class enemies like the Promethean dogs, they actually are almost just as easy to take out as they are on easy difficulty, which did seem like a shift from the earlier Halo games that we had looked at. And sure, there may have been some instances where the dogs had hyper sniper accuracy, but outside of that, they didn't seem like they had more resistance as opposed to easier difficulties. Also, when you face off against the Covenant, we can kind of see that it stays more true to what we would see in something like Halo Reach. Easy difficulty, you can just take out a grunt with some body shots, and legendary difficulty, it's a lot harder to take out a grunt with body shots if you're not getting the headshot. So it is interesting to look at the dynamic shift between the grunts and the dogs, as obviously the Prometheans were introduced in Halo 4. Also, while we're talking about nuanced levels that are a little bit different, if you load up on Midnight, the flying section between easy difficulty and legendary difficulty seemingly is mostly the same as far as we can tell. Maybe some of the enemies that shoot at you do more damage, but there's never really a section where the enemies shooting at you in the flying part are actually a threat. So it's one of those few levels where the scale between easy and legendary are actually mostly the same. Also with Halo 4, the elites are pretty tanky. Like they can eat 7 DMR shots to the head before they actually lose their shields. Then we also thought it'd be interesting to take a look at Halo 5 itself. Now in Halo 5, you do have a squad with you, and there are 3 levels that you don't actually fight any enemies, and these ones are mostly the same between difficulties. But we looked at the level The Breaking and compared the Warden fight on easy difficulty versus the Warden fight on legendary difficulty, and it is interesting because you can just see your squad mates continuously dying on legendary difficulty, and while your squad in general just seem kind of useless in fighting enemies, things just seem extra brutal on legendary difficulty. I don't know, at this point, if you needed a TLDR for the video, we probably could have just said, hey, easy mode is a bit easier than legendary, which is a fair and valid point, but we just enjoyed looking a little bit closer and actually going through each level and then replaying the level again on a different difficulty to see how they scale directly. Are there any levels from your own experience that you feel like is just stupidly hard on legendary? Let us know what your thoughts are. Also, you can follow us on Twitter. Follow me at Rocket Elijah or Luke at Rocket Sloth Luke. That's it for today though. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.